the square filled long before dawn, not merely with spectators, but with choreography, ranks of soldiers, columns of armor, the practiced discipline of a state that has for decades turned ceremony into strategy. On a dry, crystalline morning, the capital's great avenue became an arena for history and for a message aimed as much outward as it was inward. Flags snapped in a cold wind. A military band lifted a march. A commentator's cadence braided praise with threat. At the center of the spectacle stood the men at the regime's pinnacle, Marshal Pak Jong, a figure who in recent years has moved between rise, fall, and reinstatement within the North Korean hierarchy, inspected the ranks. His presence meant to do more than review uniforms. It was intended to confirm the continuity of the state's command and the cohesion of the armed forces under the supreme authority. Around him moved the parade's named principals, ministers, corps commanders, commanders of units whose titles have become as much part of the country's political grammar as the slogans themselves. The voiceover that guided viewers through the parade never strayed from the arc of the regime's self-image. Unit by unit, it projected a tidy, unambiguous story. A people tested by history, an army forged in the crucible of anti-imperialist struggle, and a leadership whose authority is coextensive with the nation's survival. One after another, formations advanced and were identified. The vanguard columns that claimed descent from the anti-Japanese resistance, the honorary cavalry, the Baekdu Mountain Guard Command, the Special Operations Brigades, the new emblematic hardware of a military that insists it can deter and retaliate against any challenger. There was ritual in every movement. As the cameras swept across the square, the commentary translated symbols into lineage, columns named for 1930s and 1940s heroes, banners described as immortal images that testify to the glorious history of our military. It was a form of nation-making in motion, a liturgy of continuity that ties the current leadership to foundational myths and historic martyrs, and yet the liturgy contained its own blunt instrument. Between paeans to the leader and descriptions of armoured columns, there were sentences meant to be read as doctrine and deterrent. A corps commander's words, delivered in a cadence meant to carry beyond the square, left no room for ambiguity. Corps Commander Bo Kwang-ju said, "No one who touches our little ones will live on this earth. If you dare to invade our sacred sovereignty, I will completely destroy you with my long sword and draw a new national border for this country." Those words were both threat and promise, a rhetorical instrument intended as a line drawn across the map and into the minds of friend and foe alike. Such language is not incidental. In these displays, the state performs sovereignty and articulates red lines in plain prose. The rhetoric reshapes the parade from pageantry into policy. These are not merely commemorative columns, but public signs that the state sees the preservation of its system and territory as existential, enforceable by overwhelming force. The parade's script also threaded more technical salutes through its narrative. The Navy was presented as a rising force, the air arms leaders were praised for guarding the skies, and the strategic rocket forces, described as the nation's nuclear warhead strategic force, were explicitly framed as ready to respond swiftly and decisively to any unforeseen aggression. In the voiceover's measured diction, you could hear the themes the leadership wants to lodge in every listener's head. Modernize and expand the armed services, show the world you can retaliate and keep your people disciplined and loyal. Among the most compelling scenes were the ceremonial and symbolic columns, those carefully constructed tableaux that marry myth and material. A column described as carrying the 19 dragon flags was presented as a living archive of the Army's continuity. Each banner a thread linking past resistance to future resolve. The Baekdu Mountain Guard, invoked repeatedly, functions in North Korean propaganda as the moral and spiritual core of the armed forces. Its appearance in any parade signals both heritage and the supreme leader's symbolic relationship to sacred geography. Intercut with that pageant was the celebration of specific operational units. The Special Operations Brigade, introduced in the commentary as the most feared, the compact, fast and resourceful force, marched in angular silence. Its discipline meant to advertise stealth and lethal readiness. A parade commentator noted the brigade marched, pledging to the people to achieve great feats, and the named officers were used to lend personality and historical continuity to units otherwise reduced to equipment numbers. There was also, beneath the ceremony, a modern practicalism, references to 10 pieces of machinery in the first corps column, or to a steel corps whose spirit would write the golden age of the last century. Those elliptical references reveal how the state deliberately frames mechanized capacity as a continuation of historical destiny, a narrative that makes artillery and armored columns not merely tools of war, but symbols of national rebirth. The interior choreography of the parade, the sequence and the pageantry, is itself a language. The honor guard and the drum cadence at the square's center set a tempo meant to be felt as much as heard. The voiceover insisted that guards stand in front of the central committee of the party, listening to the loud, blaring sound of our short-term drums. The drums and martial music are not fillers. They are an auditory reinforcement for the message that the state's heart is its central committee and that the military's first loyalty is to the party. There was also a human dimension, the faces and gestures that punctuated the formations. When the commentator asked rhetorically, "Is your hometown safe?" and then answered in the affirmative with a chorus of praise, those lines were meant to elide the war's human toll and to replace it with the myth of protective governance. The commentary repeatedly framed sacrifice in terms of honor. Soldiers were described as protecting our honor and headquarters with all our heart. That rhetorical move turns loss into sanctified service, an important psychological device for sustaining public consent in hard times. But the pageant could not entirely conceal the logic of power. The compounds of language used to describe those on parade, loyal troops, generation of loyal soldiers, high morale and unwavering fighting spirit, exist to fuse the idea of the leader with the military's institutional identity. The parade situates leadership not only as commander, but as guarantor of a moral order that requires obedience. Even nominally, apolitical units are folded into a political narrative. Military modernity is translated into fidelity. At the same time, the parade's invocation of historical figures and anniversaries works to naturalize the state's present posture. By repeatedly invoking the anti-Japanese struggle and 20th century resistance figures, the narration frames contemporary threat perceptions as the long tail of earlier national struggles. A continuity that makes current military expansion appear less like aggression and more like historical necessity, the ceremony also performed a global message, perhaps most palpably through the inclusion of men who have returned from service beyond North Korea's borders. Recent open reporting has noted the presence of North Korean military personnel in foreign theatres of conflict. The parade's commentary about heroes and veterans can be read against that backdrop. Public displays of combat experience and the naming of officers who supposedly led operations abroad serve a double purpose. Domestically, they elevate pride and martial pedigree. Internationally, they signal operational experience and willingness to project force beyond strictly defensive confines. Technology, too, was on display, not just tanks and missile launchers, but the language of modern naval and air power. The Navy was hailed as having opened up a glorious era in which the dream of building the world's best naval force has been fulfilled, while the air arm was credited with guarding the nation's skies. Those proclamations read as much like aspiration as like status reports. The posture is aspirational and declarative, a projection of what the leadership wants the armed services to be perceived as, even if external analysts vary in their assessments of actual capability. For an observer, the most revealing moments were where the parade's martial music tapered into the language of existential readiness. A voice, a parade narrator or military commentator emphasized the state's strategic deterrent. Our nation's nuclear warhead strategic force is fully prepared to respond quickly and retaliate against the enemy, even in the face of any unexpected circumstances. That is not war talk meant for domestic audiences alone. It is a message crafted for international capitals and monitoring agencies, designed to underline that any miscalculation would have consequences far beyond the peninsula. And beneath the loudest lines, there were quieter structural cues, the parade's tight sequencing, the order in which units processed, the spotlight on certain brigades and commanders, and the near ritualized mentioning of specific names. All of this composes a public ledger of favor and prominence, a way of indicating which leaders and units are ascendant and which are sidelined without the messy spectacle of public purges. Not every name in the commentary maps cleanly onto widely reported figures. Some romanizations in the broadcast differ from standard English renderings, and several officers are known more by unit titles than by public biographical profiles. Yet when established figures, the likes of the Marshal inspecting the units or the Minister of Defence standing in view, are present, their mere presence carries weight. In the context of North Korea's politics, visibility is itself a statement. It signals trust, rehabilitation, prominence, or even a transfer of influence. The parade's climax was less a crescendo than a compendium of vows, the loudest pledges of readiness, the most pointed articulations of defiance. In such moments, the state's answers to soft power and sharp coercion coalesce, rituals of legitimacy buttressed by the latent threat of violence. The parade is a pedagogical instrument, teaching new generations the vocabulary of loyalty and the contours of national danger. To an external analyst, parades are also valuable because they let you read the regime's priorities. Which units are given pride of place? Which new insignia appear? How prominently are strategic forces displayed? Answers to these questions help trace the trajectory of doctrine and the allocation of resources. The broadcast emphasis on special operations, the Navy's ambitions, and the strategic rocket forces suggests a multi-pronged approach: asymmetric capabilities, sea denial, and an insistence on long-range deterrence. But the human image remains foregrounded: banners that celebrate heroism, armoured columns that claim to carry ancestral flags, and the steady gaze of soldiers who have been taught to see the parade as both memorial and mission. The state's language turns personal sacrifice into a civic virtue. It frames the armed forces as the living repository of the nation's dignity. The parade also left the implicit impression that North Korea's leadership wants both recognition and restraint. The threats are explicit. So is the desire to be treated as a sovereign power whose security considerations matter. That dual desire, to be feared and to be acknowledged, is a defining tension of contemporary policy. It shapes how the state prepares its forces, calibrates its rhetoric, and stages its public spectacles. Finally, in the wake of the pageant, there was a quieter, more troubling note: the way every ritual served to harden a political culture whose mechanisms for grievance and negotiation are tightly controlled. When the commentary emphasized that the military would defend the party central committee with unwavering determination and that soldiers would sacrifice for their leader and homeland, it mapped out a civic geometry that leaves little organized room for dissent. The parade was, in effect, a public lesson in the contours of obedience. Taken together, the day's spectacle amounted to a layered communication. To the domestic audience, it offered reassurance, identity, and mobilization. To regional neighbours and distant capitals, it offered capability, resolve, and warning. In the cadence of drum and march, the regime spoke of continuity and of preparation for the worst. The parade's choreography was not merely performance, it was policy rendered in steel and song. For historians, diplomats, and journalists watching from afar, such public rituals provide a rare, unmediated view of how a state understands itself. They show the metaphors a regime chooses to live by, the mountain it claims, the banners it carries, the enemies it names, and they reveal the instruments it is willing to showcase when it wants to be understood. As the final columns left the square and the music receded, the slogans remained: honour, loyalty, readiness. The banners were folded away, the drums fell silent, but the words broadcast on that morning's air were designed to linger. They were an argument about the state's necessity, a promise of retaliation, and an invitation to read the country's future through the lineage of its past. And for anyone who heard the commander's promise, no one who touches our little ones will live on this earth. If you dare to invade our sacred sovereignty, I will completely destroy you with my long sword and draw a new national border for this country. There is no question about whom the message was meant to reach.